brace yourselves. With the Mike Ashley era at Newcastle, it's about to be over. For real.
Newcastle United, we're about to get a new owner.
Here comes the money, money. Oh, that didn't work.
As you can see, during this time with no football on our screens or in our stadiums, Newcastle United's potential takeover has been big news, especially among my colleagues over at HITC Sport, both of whom just so happen to be Newcastle fans. Newcastle's proposed takeover would mark the end of Mike Ashley's 13-year reign as owner of the club, an uncharming businessman who has rarely endeared himself to the people of the North East. In his place, according to most reports, Amanda Staveley's firm PCP Capital Partners would own 10% of the club, the Reuben brothers, who are the second richest family in Britain, would own another 10%, and with an 80% controlling stake in the football club would be Mohammed bin Salman, the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia. If the deal were completed, Newcastle would become the third European football club to be essentially majority owned by a foreign state, with the others being Manchester City and Paris Saint-Germain. Manchester City's owners, the City Football Group, are a company run by the United Arab Emirates' Deputy Prime Minister and member of the Emirati royal family, Sheikh Mansour. PSG are owned by Qatar Sports Investments, with their funds sourced directly from the state of Qatar, and any profits funneled back into Qatar's sport, leisure, and entertainment sectors. The states of Qatar and the UAE have been heavily criticised by various human rights organisations for their many not insignificant indiscretions, but none of them to the extent to which Saudi Arabia has been condemned. I've seen lots of opinions regarding the morality and such of Newcastle's takeover, but perhaps a little lack of information. So in this video, I intend to address that balance and ask the question, who is the potential new owner of Newcastle United, Mohammed bin Salman? Full name Mohammed bin Salman bin Abdulaziz Al Saud bin Salman is most commonly referred to simply by the initialism MBS, and it is by that colloquialism that I'll predominantly be referring to him in this video. Few people outside of the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia knew much or had even heard of Mohammed bin Salman prior to 2015, when his uncle, King Abdullah, died at the age of 90. King Abdullah was succeeded on the throne by his half-brother Salman bin Abdulaziz Al Saud, who is MBS's father. King Salman was himself 79 years of age when he inherited the throne, he had a stroke before he came to power, and he suffers from a mild form of dementia due to his Alzheimer's disease. Clearly, Salman would not be able to lead Saudi Arabia alone, and from the word go, his son Mohammed bin Salman became an influential voice. In June 2017, King Salman named MBS as the new Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia, removing the previous Crown Prince, Mohammed bin Nayef, not just the title of heir apparent, but also of all his other positions within the Saudi government at the same time. From this moment on, as far as most observers are concerned, Mohammed bin Salman became the de facto king of Saudi Arabia. Officially, MBS's titles are Crown Prince and Deputy Prime Minister, with the title of Prime Minister also belonging to King Salman, but in reality, MBS is the power behind the throne. Aged 34 now and only 31 at the time, bin Salman is the youngest Saudi crown prince there has been, never mind de facto king, and his age and inexperience have been a concern to some political commentators. Initially though, in the West, bin Salman was welcomed with open arms. Upon his ascent to power, bin Salman was considered a liberal and a progressive by Saudi standards, someone who stood for reform, less religious extremism, and increased rights for women. It is important to know that a progressive by Saudi standards and a progressive by Western standards are two very different things. The landmark policy of the Salman regime spearheaded by MBS has been the legalisation of women drivers. Saudi Arabia lifted the ban on women driving in June 2018, but up until that point, Saudi Arabia was the only nation on earth in which it was illegal for women to drive. Some political commentators observed that MBS was not so much dragging Saudi Arabia into the 21st century as he was dragging them into the 20th century. So far, does the nation trail most of the world in terms of freedoms and liberties. Nevertheless, reform is reform, some might say, and it was followed by increased participation of women in the workplace, allowing concerts with female singers, and opening the country up to a limited number of foreign tourists. You can still be publicly beheaded for practicing witchcraft or stoned to death for sodomy, but this is progress. Saudi style. There are still those who consider MBS to be a revolutionary progressive leader, but this reputation began to wane not long after his unofficial premiership. The young Crown Prince has increasingly been accused of being impulsive and remarkably ruthless, even more so than his predecessors. He has not earned the nickname Abu Rasasa, which is Arabic for father of the bullet, for lifting a ban on women driving. Here in the West, the crime that is most associated with bin Salman is probably the assassination of journalist Jamal Khashoggi. For those of you who are unaware of Khashoggi, he spent a number of years working for the Saudi government, involved in state media, before becoming a Saudi dissident, relocating to the United States, and becoming a journalist at the Washington Post. Khashoggi became an outspoken critic of King Salman, bin Salman, and Saudi Arabia's actions in Yemen up until his death in October 2018. Khashoggi entered the Saudi Arabian consulate in Istanbul in order to obtain documents related to his planned marriage. His fiancée waited for him outside, but Khashoggi would not return. He is believed to have been ambushed by 15 Saudi assassins who suffocated the journalist before dismembering his body and dissolving his remains in acid. The Saudi government initially denied Khashoggi's death before performing a U-turn and claiming the killing had been premeditated, and finally backtracking even further by conceding wrongdoing but claiming that the Crown Prince, MBS, who had been the target of much of Khashoggi's criticism, had not personally ordered the killing. The CIA's own investigation concluded that bin Salman had ordered the assassination, but President Trump disputed the findings of his own intelligence association, claiming that the investigation had to continue. Mohammed bin Salman strongly denies ordering Khashoggi's death. At a trial back in Saudi Arabia, 5 low-ranking men were sentenced to death for Khashoggi's assassination, but none who happened to be close to the Crown Prince, in a trial many in the international community considered to have been a sham. One of the reasons for Jamal Khashoggi's defection from and criticism of the Saudi regime, and an even more heinous crime that has been laid at Mohammed bin Salman's door, is the current humanitarian crisis in Yemen. The situation in Yemen is one which has gone largely under the radar in the West, despite the fact that it is a humanitarian crisis considered by the United Nations to be the worst on earth, worse even than the bloody civil war which rages in Syria and the never-ending conflict and Ebola outbreak which blights the Democratic Republic of Congo. I couldn't possibly explain the intricacies of the current situation in Yemen in detail in this video, but the country is one of geographical significance, bordering Saudi Arabia to the north, with its coastline on the Gulf of Aden, where most of the world's oil supply passes through. Since 2004, there has been a rebel Houthi insurgency in Yemen looking to overthrow the government. In 2014, the Houthi rebels took control of Yemen's capital, Sana'a, overthrowing the government by early 2015, and thus beginning the ongoing Yemeni civil war. The so-called Yemeni civil war, like so many civil wars, is really a proxy war being fought by 2 neighbouring states, Iran and Saudi Arabia. Iran and Saudi Arabia adhere to 2 different sects of the Muslim faith, Shia in the case of Iran and Sunni in the case of Saudi Arabia. I won't go into the distinctions between the 2, but essentially both nations see themselves as the powerhouses of different branches of Islam within the region, and as such, the 2 countries have been engaging in a Middle Eastern Cold War since the Iranian Revolution in 1979. Yemen's Houthi insurgency was backed by the Iranians, and Saudi Arabia wasn't too keen on having a government that was sympathetic towards Iran on their doorstep. Consequently, the Saudis spearheaded a coalition intervention in Yemen backed by the likes of the UAE, Bahrain, Egypt, Jordan and Kuwait, along with the United States and the United Kingdom in terms of training, weapons and logistical support, and according to some reports, Al-Qaeda, although that is denied by the Pentagon. As the conflict rages, terrorist organisations like Al-Qaeda and ISIS have managed to form their own militias and support bases in the country, carrying out their usual acts, which cause yet more bloodshed and terror. The legitimacy of Saudi Arabia's involvement in Yemen, at the command of King Salman and most likely more decisively Mohammed bin Salman, has been called into question, but it is up for debate. What presumably is not, is their method of warfare. Airstrikes, which have only been orchestrated by the Saudis in Yemen, are believed to have been a leading cause of civilian casualties. More damaging still, the Saudis have imposed blockades on Yemen, a country which imports between 80 to 90% of all its food and in excess of 90% of all the nation's medicine. The result is millions of men, women and children who are starving and do not have access to vital medicines, and that is why Saudi Arabia has borne the brunt of the criticism with regards to the myriad of wrongs that have happened in Yemen. Saudi Arabia has, by almost all indices, one of, if not the worst record, of human rights abuses of any nation on earth, and Mohammed bin Salman is, to all intents and purposes, the man who presides over this regime. The Khashoggi assassination and the Yemeni civil war, his critics would argue, are among his greatest crimes, but many would suggest they are mere bullet points among a much larger charge sheet. His supporters might argue that MBS remains a reformist and a progressive, an argument that becomes harder to sustain in light of Saudi Arabia's recent crackdown on feminists, as well as pointing to his and his father's Bright Vision 2030 plans for Saudi Arabia. Outlined by bin Salman back in 2016, Vision 2030 is a plan to diversify Saudi Arabia's economy away from oil and into numerous other sectors. It is something the United Arab Emirates has been doing for a number of years, successfully turning Dubai into a global tourist destination, and Saudi Arabia is now seeking to follow suit. A new beach resort is to be built on the Red Sea, along with significant investments in Saudi Arabia's health, education, and military sectors. Sport is another industry the Saudis believe they can exploit ruthlessly, planning to build an F1 racetrack, which they hope will make the Formula 1 circuit by 2023, signing a 10-year deal with WWE to host annual pay-per-view events in Saudi Arabia, and most recently paying a lucrative sum to host the heavyweight world championship boxing match between Anthony Joshua and Andy Ruiz Jr. Some have speculated that Newcastle United may be used as another string to Saudi Arabia's sporting bow, and sport has the added benefit of being an excellent distraction. The ultimate form of escapism, using sport to detract from the grisly, dirty truths of a regime, has become so common in fact that it even has its own name: sportswashing. Unlike the crimes Saudi Arabia commits in Yemen, the extremist textbooks that they post around the globe, and the human rights violations they commit on their own soil, the assassination of Jamal Khashoggi, did damage the nation's reputation in the West, so much so that some investors and businessmen refused to do business with them. Saudi Arabia and MBS have been on a PR drive ever since, and there are few finer platforms for promotion than the Premier League.